Let's pick things up there with tonight's Political Insider. Joining me, Jessica Taylor, lead digital reporter for NPR. Jessica, the Paris attacks continue to reverberate on the campaign trail here in the U.S. Several GOP presidential candidates, governors, and Senate Republicans want to delay or stop accepting Syrian refugees. But some voices inside the GOP establishment say that sends the wrong message. Do conservatives risk alienating minority voters?
Well, minority voters is someone that they really do need to reach out to this cycle. Is probably the Hispanic population is growing faster than we see Middle Eastern voters. But another point I would make is that we're seeing a lot of Republicans especially start using this as in campaign ads and sort of as a sticking point. Louisiana governor's race that's happening this weekend, where the Democrat is actually leading in a Republican state. The Republican is Senator David Vitter is now attacking his opponent over saying he wants to let in these refugees that could bring terrorist infiltration in. And we're also seeing several presidential candidates start using this not only in ads but in fundraising. John Kasich sent out a fundraising appeal along with an ad talking about this. Donald Trump just released a radio ad, and a super PAC backing Ben Carson has also put out an ad over this.
Jeb Bush was in South Carolina today. He called for a broad military buildup, suggesting the U.S. is unprepared to combat ISIS. Considering our war-weary public, is that mainstream Republican thinking, or is Bush out on a limb here?
Well, he's not the only one in the Republican Party saying this. The state senator that's also in the presidential race, Lindsey Graham, has also pushed for this. Ohio Governor John Kasich has also called for it. But anytime your last name is Bush and you're asking for an increase in troops and involvement in the Middle East, I think certainly it's a bigger risk for him pushing for this right now than many of his other rivals.
You've got a good point. All right, let's switch gears to one of Bush's rivals for the GOP nomination. Yesterday, the New York Times printed an article about Ben Carson and his grasp of foreign policy. Tell us more.
This is a very fascinating article because you had his advisors really sort of saying that he wasn't able to grasp foreign policy even after they had sort of tutored him on it and had daily calls with him and things on it. But one of the more amazing things is, you will know, Morris, is a lot of times that when you get these sources, they're on background. But this was an on-record source, a top advisor of his, saying these things, really sort of bashing his candidate and questioning what is really one of the top things that people are looking for this cycle is someone with experience on national security and foreign policy. Now, Carson's campaign fired back with another very interesting attack, saying that the advisor, who was a Reagan advisor and involved in Iran-Contra as well, was just an elderly gentleman, and that the New York Times had confused him. So it was an interesting attack back, but I think that Carson, we saw him give not a very strong response on foreign policy in last week's Republican debate, and I think stories like this really sort of only exacerbate the notion that, you know, he may have experience in other things and had a very long and distinguished career as a surgeon, but on national security, he may be out of his game.
You know, the early primary voters, they don't really care about some of this, do they? I mean, they're going for the far right, the conservatives. So far, so good for Ben Carson. It's interesting to see whoever starts doing better, they all start to get shot down by their rivals.
This hasn't been a usual election cycle for sure. We've seen such a rise in outsider candidates like Donald Trump and Ben Carson that, you know, many of us thought would begin to fade, but really haven't. But I will say, you know, we're getting into sort of the prime time when people in early states and everywhere are tuning in. We're just over 2 months now from the first votes in Iowa and a succession of states voting after that. And I think that, you know, especially in the wake of the Paris attacks, where we have this renewed concern about security and terrorism, I think more people are going to be seeing not just someone that can bring fresh ideas, but is this person ready to be commander-in-chief? I think those are two very different things.
Now, before you go, let's talk about Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal. He ended his presidential campaign yesterday saying, quote, "This is not my time." His poll numbers were low, his coffers nearly empty. Was anyone surprised by this?
I don't think it came as a big shock. He never really got traction. I mean, Bobby Jindal is someone who is a very young politician. He is a future, certainly, and was also sort of seen as a policy wonk. But as he said himself, this ended up not really being a policy election in a way. And he certainly got overshadowed. But I think, you know, without any movement and certainly his money drying up, it was kind of inevitable right now.
Who's next? I mean, you mentioned Lindsey Graham. I almost forgot about him.
I mean, you have a lot of people that have sort of been stuck there in the undercard debates, too. That's never a good place to be when you're unable to make it on the main stage. Pennsylvania Senator Rick Santorum, who was, of course, the runner-up last time to Mitt Romney, he's been able to not create the magic again. Former Virginia Governor Jim Gilmore, a lot of people also forget that he's running. He hasn't made it onto this debates at all over the past few times, but he's running as well. Former New York Governor George Pataki. So I think all of those people are ones that have been stuck in these low single digits, not raising any money. Some of them, a lot of those have been running sort of smaller campaign operations than Jindal did, so it's easier to stay afloat when you don't have as big a campaign staff. But if you're not moving and if you're not getting any traction, we're less than 100 days out from the first votes, it's something to certainly step back and consider.
We'll stay on top of this as time goes by. Jessica Taylor with NPR, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Morris.